All right, guys, our last video for the week. And it's the spread of communism after 1900. And that's like a really weird name for this chapter because it only talks about communism a little bit, or in some sections. Here's our chapter. Oh my God, look at this, guys. It's 12 terms. This is like so crazy. It's so crazy. It's wild. Okay, so one of the themes of this chapter is this title, land reform, which is often the drive and the advocacy for land reform is often what makes populations attracted or susceptible, depending on what perspective you have on communism, as attractive. Because in many of these countries we're going to talk about, like China, Ethiopia, Iran, these are countries that had massive wealth discrepancies in which governments failed to address. Land has historically been perceived as a means and access to wealth. And so governments' failures to redistribute the ownership of land in a more equitable way led to people finding more drastic means to access that kind of social and economic mobility, right? So that land reform is a big thing in the reading. When you read the chapter, you'll kind of see that. But let's get into it. So, even though China becomes communist in 1949, the Soviet Union is kind of rising. You'd think that they'd kind of be in lockstep, but really, the China charts its own path in many ways regarding communism. And even to this day, right, the Communist Party of China is still in control of China, but in a lot of ways, a lot of its policies, while Marxist in influence, are not Marxist in practice. In a lot of ways, especially because they have a market economy still in many places. So the Chinese Communist Party fights the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. They defeat them. The Kuomintang, of course, it's another proxy war, the Chinese Civil War. It's one of the first proxy wars. The U.S. funnel billions of dollars to the Chinese nationalists. It's mismanaged. It's ineffectively implemented. And the communists mainly have success not because they have more resources. In fact, they have far less resources, but their rhetoric and how they engage with the peasant population is far more effective because they articulate how communist policy is going to directly improve the lives of the people that they are the people of China. So in many ways, the Chinese Communist Party has more success because of how they interact with the peasant population, which makes up a vast majority of the population of China. When the CCP comes into power, though, in China, it gets more complicated. They tried to implement Marxism and land reform at a fundamental level. And what's so distinct about Chinese communism that's different from Bolshevik communism is that Bolshevism interpreted like you need to industrialize to then socialize. Mao pioneered or attempted to pioneer a methodology where you go from an agrarian society into a socialist society. You don't industrialize directly. And their first attempt at that was known as the Great Leap Forward. It was a policy that existed over 2 to 3 years. They ended private land ownership and reorganized the land into government-owned communes where the government directed the population that was assigned to that land to produce this much food, produce this much material, and things like that. If you used to own that land and no longer own that land, you had a really, really bad time. There were a few reasons for that. First of all, landowners actively resisted the seizure of their land, which then put them at odds with the government. The exploitation of the peasant population by the landowning class over the past generations led to a cathartic reaction of the peasants in which these peasants went ape on these landowners. And then other groups that didn't agree with even like leftist groups who didn't agree with the rate of change, or right-leaning groups who did not support the change at all, also were repressed as well. So in this reorganization of communes, it's really a fascinating event in human history, where like China, the CCP had so much influence and power in China, and with that responsibility really screwed up bad, right? They explored new agricultural methods. They tried to have everyone in China smelt their own steel in their backyard, which led to, as you'd imagine, if you had to smelt steel in your backyard, terrible steel. They did things like kill all the birds, which are very important pollinators in a region, because they were afraid that these birds were eating too much grain seed, which led to the destruction of the population that eat pests that then lead these locust swarms, eat all the crops. There's mass famine in China. As many as 40 million people starved to death as a consequence of the Great Leap Forward. I think the historically accepted number is somewhere in like the 10 to 20 million. But guys, like, that's enormous, right? Like, more people might have died in the Great Leap Forward than died in the Holocaust. So that's how immense this event was. When this occurred, the CCP was kind of, and this was all Mao's idea. The CCP was kind of like, Mao, you're out. Take a break. So Mao is kind of, even though he's like, instrumental in China becoming successful, he's kind of edged out of leadership. However, about, I think like 4 or 5 years later, China is moving away from communism because of how poorly the Great Leap Forward occurred, and this concerned Mao. And so he tried to seize power in an event known as the Cultural Revolution, where he tried to eradicate every last vestige of anti-communist culture within the Chinese kind of super culture, right? So he tried to eradicate Confucianism. He tried to eradicate any kind of market economics that had persisted in China as well. And I think the best kind of example of this with the Cultural Revolution would be the enfranchisement of adolescents in a group known as the Red Guard. So these were mainly people who'd be around your guys' age and younger, a little bit older too. Their job was to eradicate these conservative elements that had persisted within Chinese culture even after the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in the Civil War. What this meant is that, who are older than, it's like these old ideas. Old people have old ideas, which meant that many members of the Red Guard turned against their families. They accused their parents of anti-communist ideology. They accused their teachers of anti-communist ideologies, and often perpetrated like these purges or punished their parents for doing these things or for having these old ideas. The Cultural Revolution is also a crazy time. Eventually, though, other elements of the CCP seized control of the government. Mao was kind of said, please just go to bed, Mao. And Mao does go to bed and then dies shortly after going to bed. Like metaphorically going to bed. I don't want you guys to be like, he went to sleep and he died. I think he did. Who knows? That's not entirely relevant. But like Mao again went too hard. Mao gets kind of put in time out, and then Mao kind of ends his life ends a little bit after that point. And again, though the Chinese and the Soviets had the same ideology, their geopolitical interests often were in conflict with one another. They bordered each other. But also, China had these larger global aspirations. They wanted to influence the world. The Soviet Union wanted to influence the world. What the Soviet Union wanted was not necessarily always what China wanted. And so they found conflict at times there, right? One of the key points would be that though they both were communist, they preferred a communist Vietnam. Vietnam was more dependent on the Soviets than in China, specifically ideologically. So China and the Soviet Union China and Vietnam have historically butted heads. They fought a war with each other a little bit after the Vietnam War as well, and stuff like that. That should be our longest slide for this video. In Iran, you have kind of another reaction to Western intervention. So in World War II, Iran sees the Nazis as a means to break themselves out of Soviet and American and British influence. Those groups are not happy with it. The Americans and the British kind of invade Iran. They install a Shah, which is like, remember Shah Jahan and Shah Ismail from Unit 4 and 3, those guys. He's an emperor, Reza Pahlavi, but he's kind of like a pro-Western, pro-modernization, pro-secularist kind of guy, not pro-democracy. Importantly, not pro-democracy. The idea, though, is that it's a transitional government. Eventually, Iran's going to become a democracy. After World War II, the people of Iran vote. They vote a socialist into power named Mohammad Mossadegh. And guys, what a way to do both the terms, right? Both guys named Mohammed, both of them spelled differently, and that's how they spell their names. A quick little, I mean, you guys, maybe you don't care. My wife's family is Iranian, and her father came over right before the revolution, and he spelled his name with an A, but then when all the rest of his family came over as a consequence of the revolution and the Iran-Iraq war, they spelled their name with an E, and whenever you want drama, you just say, how do you spell your last name? And you start drama. That's like a fun little family conversation every time. Anyway, back to that's just Farsi and spelling things. After World War II, though, Mohammad Mossadegh is elected. He's a socialist. He wants to nationalize a portion of the oil industry, which means he doesn't want to take control of all the oil of Iran, just a part of it. And U.S. and Great Britain are like, So the company BP, they're like, And then they overthrow Mossadegh and put Pahlavi back into power, or the Pahlavi dynasty back into power. After Mossadegh's coup, the coup against Mossadegh, Pahlavi tries to attempt some reform called an event known as the White Revolution, which is a attempt to modernize and secularize. Westernize and secularize Iran. Modernize is iffy, but westernize, like really adopt like Western dress, Western style, Western culture, Western politics, accept democracy. And the progress economically is noteworthy. Like Iran grows tremendously economically as a consequence of the White Revolution. However, who gets access to that economic gain is a small subset of the population. And so that's a problem because a lot of Iranians are so poor and disenfranchised. And so that inequality leads to a larger revolution where socialist and communist elements of Iran revolt, Islamists who are hostile towards this Western agenda revolt, people who just mad revolt. And in the process of that revolt, the concept that unifies a majority of Iranians is the religion of Islam, which means that eventually Iran falls under the control of a man named Ruhollah Khomeini. And this guy is a cleric in the Shia religion. He is eventually referred to as an Ayatollah, like a supreme judge. And Iran is run as an Islamic republic, where it is a democracy, but very much, again, there's still not much democracy, but that their laws are influenced by Islam as well. They're one of the few theocracies left. Few theocracies in the world, right? But you only can run as a candidate in Iran if the religious leaders allow you to run, right? So it's like a single party democracy. That there is political expression within that system, but it isn't at all as diverse as a system that doesn't have a single party democracy, right? But they vote in Iran, so that's something about it. Then they have this very short little subtopic about Latin America. Venezuela, going into from the late 20th into the 21st century, adopts a more socialist agenda. They implement land reform. That land reform is done both by using state-owned land and also land taken from private landowners. However, the program is pretty poorly implemented. Not everyone gets the land they need. People start occupying land that's not supposed to be occupied. It's a mess. It still hasn't been resolved, and Venezuela's having a rough time right now anyway. Guatemala, they also try to do some broad land reform, and America directly intervenes, overthrows their government, and puts in a non-land reform government, because that land reform is going to happen within a socialist context. Finally, for this chapter, we have Asia and Africa land reform. So Vietnam, we talked about a little bit in the previous video, they nationalize land, they redistribute land, they try to do communism. Vietnam has a massive task to complete because they fought from 1941 to 1975. Vietnam is in a state of war that's immensely destructive towards the whole nation. And so Vietnam has to spend a lot of resources in rehabilitating their nation. They do not prioritize the redistribution of land at an equitable level, which leads to that land reform effort not really being all that successful. And Vietnam is another nation that's led by a Communist Party to this day that has transitioned to adopt more market-based policies as well. They're still pretty communist. There's still a lot of state-run businesses, but they have a private market as well. In Ethiopia and Africa, Haile Selassie is the emperor, and the Selassie dynasty had been in control of Ethiopia for a long time. And again, it's the same kind of problem with Iran, where there was an aristocracy that owned a lot of the land, that was loyal to Selassie. Selassie tried to reform, but he tried to keep the interest of this aristocracy in mind as well, which led to a pretty compromised reform effort. Eventually, Selassie is overthrown by a coup led by a man named Mengistu Haile Mariam. The Haile thing is not really related. And this government leans socialist, but then also Ethiopia falls to civil war, so they don't also implement land reform either. In India, India is more communist than you guys would probably imagine. It's been liberalized since the 1990s, but from 1947 to 1991, India had a lot of planned economics. They even had 5 years plans, which is a thing you learned about with the Soviet Union. They did land reform in a specific part of southwestern India named Kerala. It's Kerala. And if you're a senior, you might read a book about Kerala in your English classes called The God of Small Things. And in Kerala, communism's like hopping, just in Kerala, though. And so they try some things with communism, but India never goes full on into like Maoist-style communism. They do experiment with elements of socialism, but not the full embracement of communism like China does or the Soviet Union does. So that's our 8.1 through 8.4 videos. And yeah, you guys have a good week, and I will see you. You will see me, and maybe I'll see you in a few weeks, because the videos for next week are videos from the past. See you guys. Bye.